yet, had to leave the screen and go into the other room to get this, which is my newest book, which is a combination of a collection of 52 sermons, ranging across the array of concerns, both from ordinary or extraordinary events in life in the middle of ordinary time, Christmas, Advent and Christmas, Ashes to Easter, a justice section, and then a thing called signal moments, which are kind of signature sermons, etc. And that's where the Life is to be Celebrated sermon is located. But also a couple of the more recent ones are in the justice section and in the signal moments. So at any rate, thanks, Brent, for allowing to shamelessly plug the book. So there we go. And by the way, this cover picture, which I don't think you can see real easily, is a picture of the sunrise services at Easter time that Community Christian Church experienced on Brush Creek from one of those. And somebody asked me, wanting me to be very politically correct, if those balloons were really appropriate anymore because they could harm the environment, especially on a day when we're going to highlight Francis, who loved the world so much. I asked somebody who was in charge of the release, and they said, oh, they were biodegradable. I'm not so sure that they were, but that was a long while ago. And I do want to encourage you, if you do use balloons, think twice for balloon releases, and certainly use biodegradable ones if you can. So at any rate, we're engaging with very possibly the most famous saint, called by people a saint, meaning not just Catholics, but Protestants and non-Christians who call Saint Francis a saint. He is certainly one of the most revered and lionized figures in Christian history. And
Sorry, Bob, I hadn't started recording, so you might want to start.
Okay, I can start over again. And by the way, if we'll talk about my book, Life is to be Celebrated, at the end of the broadcast, and I'll put in the chat my address and a kind of deal that I'm going to cut with First Christian Church Independence. All right. So today we're dealing with very possibly the most famously known saint in the history of the world, Saint Francis. When you can call Toyohiko Kagawa the Saint Francis of Japan, you've obviously established a baseline of understanding and also a kind of gold standard for how somebody wants to be esteemed or evaluated. So Saint Francis is this extraordinary figure from the 13th century who embodies the virtues, the exemplary life of the person he follows as his savior. Saint Francis is, he doesn't live a long life, by the way. He's only on this earth in our midst for approximately 45 years. I say approximately because the day of his birth is not known. The year of his birth is even in question. It could have been 1181 from the 12th century into the 13th, or it could have been, I mean, that's his span of life. It could have been 1182. So there's some disputation on the exact year that he was born. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, by the way, this slide here, and also the figure on this slide here, is the oldest known rendition of the figure of Saint Francis captured in art. The next slide is a kind of timeline, and I kind of want to go through this and highlight some pieces. Just kind of pay attention to the years and the dates and the descriptions, and I'll skip over some, but highlight a bit of this. He's born in Assisi, which is in the Umbria region of Italy. And he's one of 7 children born to Pietro de Bernardone, a rich cloth merchant, and also Pica Borlamont, his mother. He's baptized as Giovanni, which is John, de Pietro Bernardone. So he's John, whose father is Peter, after John the Baptist, and the name and the figure favored by his mother. His mother liked the name Giovanni, but his father, because he had such a kind of affectionate relationship with the French and such a good trading relationship with them, changed his name and called him Francesco. He starts going to school. He goes to a Paris school in San Giorgio. And he kind of is known as living the high life of a young man of means, and becomes known as the kind of king of feast. He's a party animal, in other words, all right? Not as bad as St. Augustine. You got to remember St. Augustine gave us that great kind of memorable line, "Oh God, correct my immorality, but not just yet." It's something to that extent. He's a person of means. He comes from the wealthy class. I highlight Chiara del Favarone de Affresio Duccio, or otherwise known as Claire, because she comes into his life later. They're not lovers. They're not paramours. They're not anything but friends in Christ. And Claire will come to follow Francis in his life dedicated to service in just a minute. Anyway, she's born in 1193. In 1205, he sets out to kind of join the army. He has kind of a romantic notion that he wants to be a soldier. But he returns after he has a vision and receives a message in Spoleto. He begins a gradual turn towards conversion. Was he already a Christian? Yes, he'd been baptized. He's probably been through his first communion and everything else, but a real conversion to faith. He receives a message in the San Damiano, in a chapel in the San Damiano church, that he is to repair my house. And this is from God, repair my house, all right? And this is coming, the house is what? The church at Assisi. He experiences conflict with his father over this decision, and also he wants to sell a bunch of cloth in order to fund the renovations at the church. In a trial, when he's kind of claimed to be crazy and a nutcase and kind of off of his rocker, and maybe even some might even say possessed by an evil spirit, he has a trial before a bishop in 1205, and he is exonerated. He will renounce all his worldly possessions and his family inheritance and says, I don't want it. He goes and serves with lepers, and he says that he sees in lepers, like in the 25th chapter of Matthew, he sees Christ. He does eventually repair the San Damiano church. And by the way, I'm going to repeat that San Damiano several times, because San Damiano's cross will become interesting, I hope, to you, and also central in one of the illustrations we have later on in the slide deck. He hears a sermon in 1208 about the poor, and he dons what will become the classical garb of the Franciscan, a plain brown shepherd's guards, unless you're a Capuchin Franciscan, and that would be black, all right? But the traditional garb is of a plain brown garb with cinched around the middle with a rope. He will gather a few brothers that begin to like his way of life. And by the way, by this time, he is kind of known as a person who preaches to the birds. By the way, Billy Graham used to preach to cows, and he practiced his sermons in the field. But Francis will be known as a lover of animals in several ways. By 2010, he will receive final official approval from Pope Innocent III to establish a fraternal order. In 2020, the first Franciscan brothers become martyrs in Morocco, and a cardinal, a friend of Francis's, Ugolino, and this is important, remember this name, Cardinal Ugolino, is appointed protector of that order. Francis will by that time resign. He's not but 30 years old, but he will resign as the general minister of the order. And one of his first kind of buddies and partners in the endeavor of creating the Franciscans will be appointed head of the order. He will write a definitive rule of what it means to be a friar minor, in his words, in 2023, and it gets approved by Pope Honorius III. In December 1223, I think most of you may know this already, but if you don't, then hello, this is a really interesting piece of information, I think. The first living nativity scene is presented at a mass at Greccio in Italy. It's dramatized at the midnight mass. And thereafter, we will have one living nativity scene after another. We did several at Community Christian Church while I was pastor there. And I know that many of you have seen these with animals, with cows or donkeys or goats or lambs and the like. On September the 14th, 1224, he will receive what's very important in Catholic tradition, the stigmata. What are the stigmata? These are the marks of crucifixion that Christ suffered on the cross. 2 in the hands, 2 in the feet, and 1 in his side. These are the place where he was crucified, nailed to the cross, and then the side is where he was stabbed in the side with a sword. In 1225, almost blind, he will write Canticle of the Creatures. This will come up later, I could just tell you now, the Canticle of the Creatures is the basis for one of the church's most famous hymns in English. All Creatures of Our God and King is based on Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem, and it became a beautiful, beautiful song. In October the 3rd, 1226, he dies at Portiuncula, and he is buried on October the 4th. October the 4th is St. Francis's feast day in the Catholic calendar. And you will see across the United States and around the world that frequently there will be a St. Francis's Day on the first Sunday of October. Frequently also, these are blessing of the animals services. And we'll see that in a slide or two in just a moment. On July 16th, 2 years later, not even 2 years later, in 1228, his friend, Cardinal Ugolino, who's now Pope, canonizes him, makes him a saint of the church. 2 years later, his remains are moved from where he was buried to now a papal basilica that has been built in Assisi called the Basilica of San Francesco. And then I put in this timeline on the 16th of March, 2013, some 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago now. Then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who was bishop down in South America, but elected to become Pope, chose Francis as his name that he would be called by, Pope Francis, to emulate St. Francis's care for the well-being of the poor. So By the way, Francis lived a relatively short life, 45 years, all right? But life expectancy when he was born and into the, or right after he was born, actually, and so it would have been even harsher than before, but right after that, the life expectancy was, when you were born, was only 31 years. For those who reached the age of 20, it jumped to 45. And if you reach 30, living into your 50s could become a possibility. But when he was born, life expectancy wasn't as long as he lived. So let's have the next slide. Okay, we're there. These are images of St. Francis as he's remembered. The tonsure, which is kind of the shaved bald head with the hair circling it. So this is honoring God. And then all of his connections with the natural world, particularly animals, again and again and again. Let's do the next slide. This is the Papal Basilica of San Francesco on the left and on the right, on the top two panels. One is an exterior picture and the other is the interior of a side chapel. You can't see that San Damiano Cross, but you'll see it in a moment in the next slide. But this is the mother house of the Franciscan orders around the world. By the way, there are 3 of them. It's unusual for a great religious figure to create even an order, and that has been done. But it's even rarer when he creates 3 different orders, or is part of the creation of 3 different orders: the Franciscans, and then the Poor Sisters of St. Clare, and that's the person who he kind of ordained, and then also the Friars Minor. So the top 2 pictures and then this one on the lower left are all of the Papal Basilica of San Francesco. The 2 pictures on the lower right are of the Franciscan Renewal Center in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I want to commend that place to you. I have done, I want to say, probably a dozen retreats at that place. And the picture in the middle of the palm tree with the sun in the back, I took one Palm Sunday, by the way. Very interesting that I was out there at that time. And it is a great, great place to have a retreat. You should check it out the next time you're in Phoenix. Next slide. These are things that are notable about Francis or his legacy. The tau, and that's the T in the upper left-hand corner, is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And it's also the way that St. Francis would sign off his final salutation in a piece of correspondence. To him, it signified conversion and would always symbolize or mean for him how he meant to convert the world to this intimate, wonderful, caring stewardship of the world and also connection with God. The San Damiano Cross is that second picture in this slide in the upper left-hand corner there of the crucifixion, that this icon, it's an iconographic kind of cross, and this icon spoke to St. Francis and kind of gave him his connection, his calling, his purpose in life. I put the statue of St. Francis sitting there on that bench with the dog because he would have loved that. The slide in the upper right-hand piece of this slide here, that picture is from our garden in our former home in Brookside, right on opening day a couple of years ago, when I put a royal's cap on top of St. Francis. The panel on the bottom, the large oblong panel, is the stained glass from Church of the Resurrection. And they tried to put significant figures in the history of Christianity in this extraordinarily huge and beautiful stained glass rendition. And they featured St. Francis. St. Francis is in this panel. He is the person in the middle on the far right, meaning in the middle, on the picture on the lower right-hand side, on the far right, halfway up, in that brown frock. That's the depiction of St. Francis. And they've included that in this stained glass at Church of the Resurrection here in Kansas City. Next slide. This is one of the great bequests that St. Francis left to Christian history, and these are the living nativities. In the upper left-hand corner, this is a kind of cave dugout area. There's some cows in it, and this is in Italy. The live nativities picture there, Lakeland and Polk County, that's from Florida. The one on the right, I think, is actually from New York City. And then the two lower pictures, the one on the left is from Provo, Utah, which at one time, they had assembled the largest living nativity depiction and dramatization. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, they had 1,100 people, most of them angels, by the way, that are depicting angels. And then that was bested and surpassed by Wayne in the United Kingdom. It's I don't know exactly where it is, but they assembled over 1,200 people for their living nativity. Next slide. This is the other bequest that St. Francis has given to the world, not so much that he created, but that his personality, his legacy eventuated into. It became this, meaning these blessing of the animals services. The four pictures on the left-hand side of this panel are all from the Church of St. John the Divine in New York City, which is an Episcopal cathedral up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And they bring, through cooperation with the Bronx Zoo, they bring animals into the nave of the cathedral, such as camels, such as cattle, such as geese, and such as llamas. I was told that they even had an elephant come through one time through the nave. And I couldn't find it, but I'd seen at one point a very tame lion walk through the crowd at a service there in New York. You're going to have to kind of think that's apocryphal for right now. But cows and camels and llamas and geese and the like, I know that they have had. One of our members at Community Christian Church, Conchita Reyes, one time visited and was there when they did this All Saints, not All Saints, but the Blessing of the Animal service. And she brought back an inspiring possibility for us. And we began having Blessing of the Animals services at Community, although we did ours in a park. By the way, if you ever want to get a chorus of dogs to join in your liturgy, just start singing and they will sing with you. So dogs come in plentiful numbers to Blessing of the Animal services. Maybe you've done that at your church as well. And but all manner of creatures come to these services. And even now, as this slide also depicts, sometimes there's Blessing of the Animal services online. Next slide. Well, where do we start with regard to the literature or with regard to resources to learn more about St. Francis? In the 19th century, the Life of St. Francis by Saboteur was written, and that's the book on the far left. Leonardo Boff wrote a book about the prayers of St. Francis, and that's very good. There's a scholarly treatment of Francis of Assisi, and I cannot remember the name of the author there. I can't read it either. So, but it is a notable book and would be worthy of your attention. I think the next two books are kind of baseline, and you would do well to have them for your library. G.K. Chesterton has a wonderful brief biography, but it's beautifully written. It captures not only St. Francis's life in terms of its chronology and the facts and figures, but also the spirit in which he lived and the spirit in which G.K. Chesterton adoringly remembers him. Then, in his own words, these are the book that has the T or the Tau on it. That is an essential piece to really understand St. Francis. And then Murray Bodo is a Franciscan monk, and he has kind of distilled St. Francis's teachings into 7 that he gathers under the title Surrounded by Love. We're going to see a video in just a moment of him, and he'll be dressed as a Franciscan and talking about spirituality that Francis embodied. So, by the way, there's a book by Nikos Kazantzakis. He wrote a novel about St. Francis. Catherine Patterson wrote a book called Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon that is both about Francis and Clare. Brother Ugolino wrote a book called The Little Flowers of St. Francis. The Road to Assisi is understood to be an essential biography. I'm not so sure that it is essential, but it is a good book. But this Paul Sabatier really is a French Protestant, actually, who captures a lot of who Francis was and what he means. Next slide. Okay, these are the video resources. We're going to see this piece by Murray Bodo in just a minute, what sums up St. Francis' spirituality. But you can find this online, the Franciscan Spirituality, Contributions of the Franciscans to the Life of the Church. That's about 45 minutes. Francis and Clare of Assisi. You can watch the whole movie on your computer via YouTube. I'm not sure that I recommend it as a great movie. And I really don't recommend the St. Francis of Assisi movie, God's Fool. It's really badly acted. It's not good. From what I can tell, I couldn't make it through the whole thing. But then also in 1961, Brad Dillon did a movie, and Stuart Whitman is in this, and it was Francis of Assisi. It was a full-length theatrical release that I think was too late. The 50s were a time when you had The Robe, you had Quo Vadis, you had all these movies that captured or tried to capture biblical characters were very popular in the 40s and the 50s. And this one was a little bit too late. I don't know why it got released only in 61, but I haven't seen it all, but I would recommend that you see that. It'll capture the outline of his trajectory through history. And then Brother, Sun, Sister Moon was Zeffirelli's very famous movie that was done in 72. So the next thing we're going to see is this video portrayal or video link of Murray Bodo. By the way, he's a poet and he does some poetry readings, and you can see his teaching. He's a Franciscan of import and significance. Let me just say that there are notable Franciscans who are pretty famous now. I'll do this after this, the video here. Well, let me go ahead. Here we go.
The Canticle of the Creature Francis summed up his whole spirituality and his whole life, because he praises God by being a part of all of the created world. And he singles out the four elements of earth, water, air, and fire. And he calls them his brother and sisters. Brother fire, sister water, brother wind, sister mother earth. They became his brother and sister, and he praised God with them and by means of them. The universe that God created is the primary revelation to us. It's the primary scripture. And I saw in Francis someone who will help us connect again to the animals, to the birds, to the oceans, to the earth itself.
One could say that St. Francis is the patron saint, if you will, of environmentalism, and you would be accurate in saying that. Other famous Franciscans, by the way, who have made their mark in the world and in the church I'm just going to lift up three of them. One is Father Michael Judge. Some of you who will remember this very famous picture of the firefighters taking out a priest who had gone into the World Trade Center towers and had been killed when they collapsed, carrying his body, his broken and dead body, out of the rubble. And that was Father Michael Judge, and he had been a chaplain to the firefighters all across New York and was a very selfless person. And he died in that Franciscan frock that I've highlighted as their normal garb. Bishop O'Malley, who's now cardinal for the Archdiocese of Boston and was put in charge of the protection of children and of minors by Pope Francis, and serves as a kind of, if not confessor, at least a confidant for Pope Francis. And he is a Franciscan. And maybe the most widely read Franciscan, even more widely read than Francis right now, is Richard Rohr, whose Center for Contemplation and Action in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and through the Enneagram, actually, through his teaching and mentoring of teachers of the Enneagram and its usefulness for spiritual development, is one of the most famous Franciscans ever seen, actually. So I commend all of his books to you, Father Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. Some of you, I'm sure, have already read him. Next slide. So we should ask, why is St. Francis a great soul? I mean, what makes him great? And I want to suggest, first of all, it's his faithfulness. One could also say audacity. You don't give up all your worldly possessions, say, I don't want your inheritance, Father. I'm not the prodigal son. I don't need it. I'm not the elder brother. I don't want it. I renounce it, and I will just serve God. You don't do that unless you really, really mean business. And he did. He was audacious in that respect. He had an abiding faithfulness to cling to what he believed as an undeniable, unequivocal call on his life. Next slide. He also loved nature. He loved preaching to the birds. He loved creating the living nativity. He loved all creatures. As this hymn goes, all creatures of our God and King. And as Murray Bodo, the Franciscan monk, was saying, it's in his love of nature that he believes he's found a text, if you will, a text for reading the essence of who God is and who human beings are created and meant to be. It is in nature that he will find great, great joy. He is not a nature denying, earthly denying, negative voice against this world. No, he loves this world. There is a great poet named Oship Mandelstam who would have won the Nobel Prize had he not been locked up by Stalin and put in a gulag for years and years and years. If he had lived a longer life, he didn't reach his 50th birthday, but he said in a poem, he says, "I love this poor old earth, for it is the only one I've ever known." And that was St. Francis. He loved the earth. He loved the world. It was a gift from God, and through it, he heard God speak, and he heard how he was to live. Next slide. Now we come to a little point of contention and controversy. The enduringly famous prayer attributed to him. It is one of the most famous prayers in the world. It's not as famous as the Lord's Prayer. That's pretty much the most famous Christian prayer. But this St. Francis prayer is really powerful. And I'd like us to say it together, if you don't mind. If we could go to the next slide. And hopefully you can read this and we can say it together. I can't hear you, but hopefully you can hear me, okay? And we will read it together. I'll read it at a steady pace, not too slow, and hopefully not too fast. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. I hate to disabuse you of your love of this poem, but I don't want to disabuse you of your love of the poem and the prayer, the poetic power of it. But I must tell you that it is not necessarily from the actual pen of St. Francis. It has uncertain origins. That's the best way to put it. We won't impugn St. Francis for stealing it, which he did not. We don't know if he even ever said it. It's not extant in the writings of his, but it has been attributed to him again and again and again, and it is known affectionately as the prayer of St. Francis. That enduringly powerful prayer is one of the things that makes St. Francis great. The way I'd put it is this: even if he didn't write it, it so summarily encapsulates his personality, his focus, his being, that it is a pretty good tribute to his life and his legacy. Let's do the next slide. Lastly, I think it cannot be emphasized enough that one of the things that makes St. Francis a great soul is his utterly profound, enduring love of the world, his love for the world, his love for others. And I'd like you to listen to two things right now. Stay on this slide, Brent, but I want to quote G.K. Chesterton here, who has a great statement And then I'm going to read another of his statements, and you'll get to read it along with me in the next slide, but we're not going to go there just yet. Chesterton says about the kind of summation of St. Francis's life, this: however wild and romantic his gyrations might appear to many, Francis always hung on to reason by one invisible and indestructible hair. The great saint was sane. He was not a mere eccentric because he was always turning towards the center. He was always turning toward the center and heart of the maze. He took the queerest and most zigzag shortcuts through the wood, but he was always going home. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful statement. But the next one is even more powerful. If you could go to the next slide, Brent. What gave St. Francis his extraordinary personal power was this: that from the Pope to the beggar, from the Sultan of Syria in his pavilion to the ragged robbers crawling out of the wood, there was never a man who looked into those brown burning eyes without being certain that Francis Bernardoni was really interested in him, in his own inner individual life from the cradle to the grave, that he himself was being valued and taken seriously and not merely added to the spoils of some social policy or the names in some clerical document. In other words, he never treated somebody with a name like they were a number, but that they had an essence, a valued essence in the world. So that's the four things I think that make St. Francis a great soul. You have the prayer. You have these quotes that you could use as prayer prompts and points for contemplation, for silence and meditation. And you certainly have a lot of things like animals and living nativities and blessing of the animal services and the like. By the way, there's some St. Francises around that are not this St. Francis. If you go to St. Francis Xavier Church on Troost, that's a great, great church. It's called the Fish Church, but that's not St. Francis of Assisi. That's St. Francis Xavier, who was one of the founders of the Jesuits, who was named after St. Francis, but is not the St. Francis of Assisi that we're focusing on now. Next slide. After that, there we go. Time's yours. Q&A, discussions, alternative views, and the like.
Well, I guess one of the things I'm glad to hear, Bob, is as a veterinarian, people lift up St. Francis of Assisi to me all the time, but all they seem to know about him is his love of animals. But yet you started off talking about his love of the poor and of people. And I guess sometimes St. Francis is sort of used as a way to lift animals above humans. And that doesn't sound like that's what he actually did. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. Remember that his very first action after he renounces his wealth and becomes a mendicant, actually, he's going around begging. There's some things about St. Francis and Franciscans that I don't encourage, and I don't really appreciate that much. The mendicancy, which is begging for food and not relying upon the world for your means, and never, having property and the like. I don't necessarily recommend, but those are in the old days. By the way, this will sound a little, I'm not trying to be punitive nor ironic. I don't believe in irony all the time. I don't believe in looking for negativity, but I did do a little research on this and wanted to know where the Franciscans were during the Inquisition. A mere 25 years after Francis's death, the Franciscans were enrolled in the Pope's Inquisition across the face of Europe, rooting out people who wouldn't believe, and through the use of torture, compelling conversions. They did that. They just did. But they're not alone. I mean, every order on the face of the planet that the Catholics had at that time were part and parcel of this. And it came from the top. It came from the Pope. By the way, disciples our hands aren't clean either.
No.
Disciples have founders who owned slaves and would never go into the abolitionist camp ever. Some of us, the Campbells never did. And we have to remember Jim Jones was a part of our expression of faith. So our hands are not pure either. But St. Francis's abiding legacy is his care for the poor. And remember that his first action, after he renounced his wealth and all possessions, was to minister to lepers and to see Christ in the face of lepers. Hospitality is a very, very big virtue that is embodied, exemplified in a supremely nice way in almost every Franciscan retreat center there is. That place in Scottsdale is the height of hospitality, and that's one of their abiding values. Normally, ordered priests, not all of them do this, but ordered, not diocesan priests. Diocesan priests do not take a vow of poverty, but ordered priests, like the Jesuits or like Franciscans, take a vow of poverty, a vow of chastity, and a vow of obedience. And those are their three vows that they take when they become part of that particular order. Francis also needs to be remembered and extolled for what was his joy. And I haven't emphasized that enough right now. I should. He was a joyful person. That's what some people caused some people to think that he was kind of crazy, because he was always laughing and always happy. At the same time that privately, he was very earnest in his prayer life and wanting to be obedient to God.
It's okay to go ahead and have. I also noticed as you started talking about his life that he and Saint Ignatius of Loyola sort of started out and had a lot in common, didn't they? As far as being a wealthy, son and being in the military and all of that, and then having a calling from God that totally changed their lives.
It's interesting how wealth can lead to people taking on voluntary poverty. Yeah. One of the more interesting things in the Protestant realm on this is Millard Fuller. Millard Fuller was a multi-millionaire lawyer, but his life was coming apart at the seams. His marriage was falling into disarray, and he went to visit Clarence Jordan, the person who had created a thing called Koinonia Farms in Americus, Georgia, not right near where Jimmy Carter lives to this day. Yeah. Later on, Millard Fuller and Clarence Jordan will create, guess what? Habitat for Humanity. And they will
Jimmy Carter
do something for the poor in a magnificently beautiful way all around the world. But Millard Fuller started off super wealthy. Yeah, Ignatius of Loyola and St. Francis are in that same camp.
And they were both classified as party boys and
party boys. And St. Augustine is the party boy of all party boys.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Claire. Did that as being one that Francis ordained or whatever? Did she also grow up wealthy or?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. Okay.
But I do not know enough about her. I need to do a little bit more research. So let me claim ignorance at this point. Sorry.
Is there a lot of information on her that we?
Oh God, yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
There is. I just haven't had time to read it all.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a lot. There's a ton of books on St. Francis. And probably every few years they keep coming out in, this would be the 740th year of, or 840th year of his life. I mean, anniversary of his birth right now. I suspect in 2026, there will be a rash of books come out in honor of a very significant anniversary of his death. So that would be 800. Oh boy, that'd be 800 years. Yeah, 800. The 800th anniversary of his death will happen in 2026.
Got it. Okay, wow.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. Wow. Other comments?
I was just gonna say, anytime I think of Francis of Assisi, I think of bird in his hand and, squirrels on the ground. It was just nice to hear what precipitated it and that there was more to him than that. That's all. I just find that very fascinating.
What the Great Souls series tries to do, or at least what I try to do in this series with you all, is to show that these figures are very complicated. They're not reducible to some kind of trope or to some kind of stereotype. Oh, St. Francis, he's the one about the animals, right?
Yeah,
That's what you think.
No,
that's what you hear all the time.
He is invoked by more peace activists than probably any other saint.
Good.
They point to him as kind of the patron saint of peacemaking as well.
Margaret was saying earlier that he could also be seen as sort of the patron saint of environmentalism, right? Or of climate
absolutely,
change or whatever.
absolutely.
He'd be right on that
He
right
is
now.
called that now.
Yeah. Definitely would be.
I appreciate Bob doing that.
And by the way, speaking of environmentalism, we get into lots of contretemps in the public discussion about climate change. And they say, oh, well, I know a bunch of scientists who don't believe that. And then somebody cites the UN and the 97% who've signed on to the fact of global warming and climate change and how human beings have affected it. If you've ever lived in Los Angeles, you've witnessed how human beings adversely affected the environment and then how they made some policy changes to correct it. And I lived there when the smog was in such a horrendous thickness that kids were disallowed from going outside. They had to wear a handkerchief over their faces as they scuttled into the school and stayed inside all day in air conditioning where the filters would keep out the smog and then rush back to the bus to get home. There were brownout days when people were advised if they had respiratory or pulmonary problems, they were not to go outside at all. Because they put in laws for catalytic converters that then became universal across the United States. It wasn't so at the time, but California led the way. They cleaned up the smog in the LA basin. That's what we're talking about, is that you can do things to improve life. And if you're inspired by St. Francis, all the better. And everybody can do something from picking up gum wrappers and trash to not polluting the earth. We don't have open fires anymore in our neighborhoods like my grandmother had in Teague, Texas. I love to burn the trash out in the back. We don't do that anymore. Why? Because it harms the air that we breathe. We don't need to do it. So.
Boy, that just took me back to my childhood. Carrying trash out the back.
And
I always wanted, when I visited my grandmother, I always wanted to be in charge of garbage duty.
You're a strange man. Has anyone ever told you that before?
Oh, yeah. But I wanted to do it because I got to play with fire, you know?
Oh, okay,
Ah.
cool.
So here's the deal on the book, and let me, I'll hold this up again. I have a new book out, and Brent said I ought to suggest that you all find it and buy it. That'd be great. I'm not gonna give it away, but it's a book, a collection of 52 sermons, and I'm going to. This is the book here. Life is to be celebrated, and selected sermons, messages for the 21st century. And I'm going to make a deal. The book sells for $14.95. If you'll send me just one nickel more, I'll mail it to you. I'll mail a signed copy to you. How about that? And this is my address, and you can just send a check that way. I think I even know how to do Venmo.
Wow.
I don't.
And I can probably take a charge over the phone, and Brent can, let me put that in the chat too. I can put my phone number.
I finally figured out what it was a few weeks ago. I don't do it.
How do you like your new apartment?
Oh, I love it. We absolutely love it.
That's great.
There's my phone number. I just put it in the chat, and Brent just put it up there now on the slide. Thank you, Brent. 506-1014, and just call me or send me a check, and I'll send you a book signed copy. And let me know how you want me to sign it too.
Oh,
But I'll just, for $15, I'll throw in the handling, the packaging, and the mail costs. How about that?
oh, yes. Sounds
Yeah.
great. Awesome. Awesome.
Well, we certainly appreciate this. I don't know if anybody has any last questions or comments.
Always appreciate you coming.
Yes, we appreciate all you've done. Bob.
Always learn a
All these
lot.
months. Oh, my goodness.
Well, we have 2 more slated. I'll keep on going until I get it right, okay?
You're getting it right.
Sounds like a deal.
We love it.
The next 2 are very interesting. And by the way, they were contemporaries for a portion of their lives, and they were very, very special friends. One is William Sloane Coffin, arguably the greatest preacher who championed civil rights and peace that our nation has ever known. And his preaching is unbelievably great. And that's on December, the first Sunday of December, Brent. I can't remember exactly. December 5th?
The 28th is Sunday, so.
So that'd be the 7th?
It's the 6th, I think.
December the 6th, okay?
It's the 5th.
It's the 5th.
Okay.
Pleading for the 5th.
I'll be done with classes by then, so the calendar kind of goes out the window, so.
So December the 5th, that first Sunday, we'll do William Sloane Coffin. And then on January 2nd, unless Brent says, no, we can't do it then, January the 2nd, we will do Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yes.
One of the greatest geniuses of the last 500 years.
Wow.
Say Abraham, Martin, and John.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very,
Appreciate it.
very enlightening.
Have a good one. Go Chiefs.
All right.
Does somebody want to close with a prayer or something?
Do the best, go best.
Sure. Lord, we thank you for Bob, who is willing to share his time with us, for Brent, who is willing to coordinate it all and make all of the technology work. And most of all, we thank you for the ability to look back in time and continue to learn things that hopefully not only add wrinkles to our brain, but inspire us to continue to grow in our Christian faith and in our understanding of what we can do to be a better part of the earth you have given us. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're gonna have a game sometime. Somebody's gonna